Cool. So, all right. So, Rollie Goodman. So, here's what we'll do. I'm going to sort of give like a short intro for you and who you are. We'll talk about some of the topics we might cover here, and then I'm going to start asking you questions, and you can start telling
Awesome.
stories. Sweet.
Love it. Let's go.
All right. So, Rollie Goodman, you're currently living in Denver, right? And
Sure.
so we met at our last job together, and you were at that time a data scientist and then a machine learning engineer. You have a degree in economics from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. You have a master's in computer science from Montana State University in Bozeman, and you are somebody that I'm happy to call a friend. So welcome to the podcast.
Oh shucks, happy to be here. And yeah, thank you for doing the intro for me because every time someone asks me to, I have two options, which is either my entire life story or just panicking and saying nothing. So I appreciate you laying the groundwork.
Well, we still want the former of those, right? The whole life story, like we'll get there. And in
Oh
fact, so
boy.
talking about things that we want to talk about, that is part of it, right? So like the whole point of this here is to give you a place to tell your stories and for us to hear them, and so that we'll dig into that sort of identity, who you are, how you got to be who you are. Then we'll talk about we'll actually get into some career stuff, tech stuff, job stuff. So talking about a recent change that you have made and are making, sort of in the direction of your career. We'll talk a little bit about machine learning, data science. We'll talk about gender issues in technology and diversity in technology, and hopefully we'll talk about your puppy a bit too, and kind of take things as they go from there. And I'm sure we'll meander and maybe get off track and pull ourselves back on at some point. But that's the outline.
Yeah, that sounds great. I have been known to meander, so I think we can expect a certain amount of that.
Awesome. So, all right. So now that I've introduced you, how would you introduce you? So, like, who is Rollie Goodman? Who are you?
Yeah. So I spent a while thinking about this and a while thinking about formative moments in my life. And I realized in general, the way I introduce myself, I think I'm really funny. So I call myself a recovering economist a lot. You've probably gotten that line from me. I guess at this point, I can probably also call myself a recovering data scientist. So now there are two past things I can define myself by. Um, I am the product of two academics, two professors. So there was a it's amazing that I've turned out any degree of socially normal. I will say that. That's just how it goes there.
Are they
And just
both sort of like your stereotypical like introverted professor? Uh, like how would you describe your parents?
I think so they're both in STEM fields, both incredibly smart. The way I would have described my father, kind of if I had a snapshot of him to go with as a caricature of an academic, is around about from about 8 p.m. every night onward, he would be wandering around in an old bathrobe with a glass of port and usually a paper or something, just kind of looking vaguely lost in the house. Like that was the deal in the evening. He was thinking about something, and man, he was gonna have his glass of port with it, and he was just kind of gonna wander with it. Um,
A
yeah,
thinker.
so
Yeah.
exactly. And like I mentioned, they were both in STEM fields. I don't know whether it was as a form of like some sort of misguided rebellion or because there was a certain amount of parental pressure maybe regarding sort of the hard sciences and math. I was wildly convinced that I would never follow that path. So we can see where I've ended up. Clearly, I did not do a great job of fighting my destiny. But yeah, absolutely raised in a house where, academics was incredibly important and where there was no real half-assing anything because if I didn't know something, one, if not both parents did and knew that I was making it up.
Well, as far as like pressure goes and rebellion goes, so yeah, that was going to be a question: is whether your parents put pressure on you. It sounds like they did. But as far as rebellion goes, you still went to school. You just decided to get a degree in economics with an emphasis in international and economic development.
I did. And, well, I did and I didn't. When I initially decided to go to college, I decided I was going in for political science. And I think my parents were banking on the unfortunately empirically correct assumption that you don't usually stick with your first major. So I went in political science. I was fairly convinced that I was not a math person. And as I'd been thinking about the questions you asked me about formative moments, things like that, I realized that more or less the two biggest turning points in my life were based around two incorrect stories that I spent a very long time telling myself. One of them was this: I am not good at math. There were layers to that. The first one is, obviously there was a certain level of anxiety with having parents who were very math oriented and trying to learn it.
What were their fields, if you don't mind me asking?
So my dad was a biostatistician,
Okay.
And a marine biologist. And then my mom taught med school, actually. So she specialized in infectious disease. If you're ever wondering why I use Lysol wipes on my phone, this is like a great explanation of that. I remember when I was a kid, like this fun game, I guess, I used to play was she would bring home, like Petri dishes and auger plates and stuff from her lab. And I would get to swab various surfaces in the house and then see what like awful stuff grew out of it. So yeah, maybe that's a third formative moment in terms of my cleaning habit.
Yeah. That would terrify you as a child.
Oh yeah. As a child, I mostly thought it was really cool. And then I got old enough to kind of understand the chain of events and was like, oh, I don't like that at all. So it was a little bit of a slow burn.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've already gotten myself off track.
So the first, you were telling the story of maybe the first formative moment or the first maybe pivotal time in your life, which had to do with telling yourself the story that you weren't good at math.
Yep. And that was sort of compounded a lot by the societal dialogue, which I hope is slowly dwindling. I like to think it is. This was 25 years ago. But the societal idea of, girls are good at communicating and language, boys are good at math and logic. That was a message I was getting pretty much from all angles as a kid. And it wasn't so much the idea of, you as an individual woman are going to be bad at math. It's, in general, this is kind of the broader thing, and chances are you'll fall into it. And I remember even being a young kid, I was probably in 5th grade or something, and I was struggling with some math concepts. I don't even remember what it was at that point. Because there comes a point where math gets difficult. And the female teacher telling me, oh, it's okay, just girls aren't as good at this. Like, it's going to take you longer to get it. And of course, for me, I took this even more to heart because with the girls are good at communicating phase of that, I do or did have a bit of a knack for languages. And of course, now that I've said that, I'm sure that this is like the least eloquent I'll ever be in public. So maybe I shouldn't have said it. But, as a kid, I was a big reader. I had a good vocabulary. My mom really encouraged me to read at a young age. She read to me a lot when she stayed home with me my first couple of years. So in my head, it just clicked like, oh yeah, this material is getting difficult. I get anxious about it. That's not because learning a thing is hard. It's because I am somehow wired to not do well at it, to not get it. And that's a story I told myself until I guess my second year of college. So
it's kind of not to like totally derail here, but it's fascinating because thinking to my own childhood, I don't think I was ever told that I couldn't do something. Like this is, and so this is sort of me throwing something out there. This is a theory that I'm interested to get your take on. it seems to me like the difference is that women are told they can't do things, men are told they shouldn't do things. It's like, men, it's like, you shouldn't be a nurse. That's a, whatever. Like, that's not what men do. It's not that you can't do it. Like, you're capable of doing anything, but we're going to judge you based on the things you choose to do. Whereas women are told you're not capable of doing things.
I think there probably is an element of that, for sure. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, this idea of, it's not, you shouldn't do it because it's not manly, because it's not whatever, not because you don't have the knack for it. Although I suppose maybe there is a parallel of can't as well. I don't know. You'll have to let me know if this aligns with your experience. But this is something I actually run into in discussions around gender equality in tech a lot, where there's this line that sometimes gets pushed of, oh, we need more women in leadership positions, which is great. I agree with that part, because they're going to bring more empathy and more communication skills and more nurturing. And, that's something that male leaders just can't provide. There's this idea that it's something inherent rather than male leaders act as male leaders have been socialized to act, sort of deal. I'm curious if that's part of a similar dynamic or not.
Yeah, it's interesting, and a lot of this is, attitudes have changed in segments of society. Like, it's really hard to draw. I don't actually, and maybe this is the best blanket statement I can offer for my comments in this area is, all I can say is what I've seen from my perspective, but I have to acknowledge that my perspective is limited. So it could be that a lot of my understandings and feelings around some of these things are totally wrong. But I hope that trying to come at it from a space of empathy, and that I hope that errors will be forgiven.
I think we're all operating. I don't think anybody has like a holistic understanding of like, nope, this societal thing is a monolith and I can speak to all of it.
Right.
So.
That, like, the thing I see, that my point of view and perception is the truth of everywhere, right? Like, obviously that's not true.
Right. Yeah. So I think we can proceed knowing that we both understand that about each other at this point. I hope so.
But I did derail your story. So you'd been told that you were not good at math. You had been told that women are good at communicating. You had sort of had that reinforced through being good at language. That was kind of where I cut you off.
Yeah, no. The only way I really started untelling myself that story, and then also how I sort of evolved into this career trajectory, was I took my first couple of classes in the poli-sci department, and I liked some aspects of them. There were others that I found frustrating for various reasons. But in order to be a poli-sci major, you had to have taken, I think, like Econ 101 and maybe one other econ class. And I sort of lucked out because I just chose a random section of Econ 101 or 100 or whatever. It wasn't a non-majors one. It was the intro level in the major. And I got a professor who I just clicked really well with. Because something I didn't like about poli-sci is that it was highly prescriptive and very like, nope, these are the definitions. Here's the lens where we view this thing. This professor, his name is Martin Hart Landsberg. I think he's retired now, but I really enjoyed his teaching style. He was much more like left-leaning than you would consider most like traditional economists. Think of, right, there's like the Chicago School or whatever. But the way he approached even his Econ 101 class is a little bit financially unfortunate because we had to buy 2 textbooks. But one was your very standard run-of-the-mill, here is the sort of accepted Econ 100 material. Another one was a more left-leaning, more non-traditional one. He said, okay, every unit that we cover, we're going to read both corresponding chapters of the same book, or like of each book. And then on the test, you can put whichever one you think is correct, right? You have to be pulling your answers from the material, but I'm not saying that one or the other of these is right. I want you to get exposure to both of them. So I loved it, and I decided, yeah, this is the direction I want to go. If this is what econ can be like, I'm excited about it. But econ required, as one would hope, a lot more of math classes, which gave me a lot of hesitation initially. I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll add a minor, whatever. Once again, I just got really lucky. I had to take like a intro level calc course, and I got a professor who was off the charts on sort of the emotional intelligence side. This is John Crussell. He's now actually a dean at the college, and I couldn't be more excited to have him in that position because he is someone who cares so deeply about students. And at one point, I had gone in to his office hours with some sort of question early on, and I did a sort of self-deprecating, like, oh, sorry, like, I don't get this. I'm really bad at math. And he looked at me very seriously and just said, you're not bad at math. You are just absolutely terrified of it. Somehow this idea had never occurred to me. There was this nice sound of like shattering glass, I think, somewhere in my mind, like that one scene in How I Met Your Mother. The math department in general at the university was super friendly. This professor had amazing office hours in general. Everybody in the math department really sort of had an open door policy. And it was through being able to actually sit down and do my homework there in the math department with people around, not feeling like I was just on my own kind of spinning out in an anxiety spiral, that I finally started to realize that, oh, okay, you know, there's still knowledge gaps because I spent 15 years having a minor panic attack every time I saw like arithmetic, but that, oh, I'm not actually bad at this. It's difficult because it's supposed to be difficult. Yeah, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. That was a long explanation, but
no, it's great. How did did that change your, I guess first off, how did you overcome that fear? Was it just through sort of the enthusiasm and working with other people and sort of that, having that supportive community?
I think a lot of it was that. It was a sort of exposure therapy for me, where instead of math being this thing that you did alone at your desk in a locked room trying not to cry the whole time, I was surrounded by a bunch of people who were kind of excited about math for math's sake and really liked what they were doing. And if you weren't getting something, rather than it being a moral failing or some sort of like personality flaw in you that you didn't get it, there were probably 4 people within earshot who like it would make their day to get to go through this on a whiteboard with you.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was not what you'd expect to find at a small like liberal arts college in Portland that specializes in its environmental law program, for sure. But the math department there really is kind of a gem. So I guess maybe that's a third way in which I got really lucky, is just sort of happening upon that group of people and getting brought into it.
So other than sort of taking away your fear of math, did that change your attitude towards it in other ways? Like, did you develop a love of math, or is it still kind of a thing where it's like, it's a thing I use, I don't love it? Like, so where do you fall there?
I still have a mild amount of instinctive panic toward it. So we're going to see. Maybe I should be like classically conditioning myself somehow with it. But I did start to genuinely enjoy some of it. I found like linear algebra and discrete math for some reason to be much more what I gravitated towards. Calculus, I never got along with quite as well. I'm not sure why. Had I stayed in econ, that would have been a really big problem because that's a big thing there. Not that calculus is unimportant in machine learning, but luckily with most of the libraries, you can get by without like a incredibly deep intuitive understanding of it. But it opened me up to the idea enough that math could be this fun, interesting, even creative thing that I absolutely would never have then gravitated further into the computer science world if I hadn't had that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so my own experience with math is that I am yeah, probably a little afraid of it, a little intimidated. Also just never enjoyed it. So, and unlike you, I had a really awful experience with math at school. Um, I won't take up a bunch of time here, but I love telling this story, and it's that I got into my second semester of calc, and you know how you're like going through the first day, and the professor's like going through the syllabus, and then has time to ask for questions. And when he got to the questions, I remember somebody raised their hand and said, "Is it true that last semester the average on the final was a 33%?" And the professor just got this smug, like shit-eating grin on his face, and said it was a 32. Next question. And I was
Oh
just like, what? What the fuck?
my
And yeah, I out of everybody that I knew that took the class, we all ended up dropping it at some point. I held on for like 3 weeks and then ended up dropping it. But yeah, nobody I knew survived that class. It's crazy how much of a difference the professors, the instructors, their willingness and desire to actually teach uh, matters.
Yep, absolutely. Well, and maybe that's where I got lucky as well, is because Lewis and Clark was really a teaching school and not a research school. And so the professors who were there because they somehow I don't understand this because I would probably lose my mind, but they were there because they liked teaching undergrads. Like actively, that was the thing they wanted to do. And I think that probably made a huge amount of difference because particularly at research universities, there's those kind of perverse incentives of ostensibly this is about teaching these 19-year-old calculus, but it also attracts a lot of the people who are there because they need to write a bunch of grants and they've got stuff to do, and you probably can't fit them and their ego in the same room sometimes. Sometimes you can, and it's not a recipe for a good experience as a student. So
Yeah, there's a really fascinating problem in education. There are lots of problems in education, but from my own experience, I went to Brigham Young University, which is a private university, of course, Mormon University, which I grew up Mormon. Difficult to get into, can be. You have to have really good grades and test well and everything. And then I went from there to Utah Valley University, which was like a recently upjumped community college. Like the university, they'd only gotten the university status like a couple of years before I started going there. And, geographically co-located more or less. But it was fascinating to see because going from one to the other, the juxtaposition of seeing sort of the different student bodies and seeing the different faculty, because the really sort of fascinating paradox that I saw, and maybe this was only there, I'm sure this isn't everywhere, but it was that at BYU, where it was kind of a prestigious, like more of a research university, you had this thing where it was like the students had to try really hard to get in, right? So the students are there to learn, the teachers aren't there to teach. But then you go to like a smaller sort of like community type setting, and it's the opposite, where like the teachers aren't there to do like, they're not there for prestige, they're not there for, and so, but the students, because it's easy to get in, tuition's cheap, whatever, like there's less of a, or there can be less of a desire to learn. So you're either at a school where the students want to learn but the teachers don't want to teach, or you're at a school where the teachers want to teach but the students don't want to learn.
yep. Man, there's got to be just one university somewhere that's just at the intersection of the Venn diagram. Unfortunately, there are
Yeah.
also probably ones that are in the complete outer portion, I guess. But there's got to be at least one where it just like the stars align. If so, I haven't found it.
And those
But
are, I mean, those are both kind of like extreme statements. Like even within those universities, there are teachers that want to teach, that meet students that want to learn, and in both settings. But as sort of a trend, like that it was fascinating to see that.
yep, absolutely.
So that was kind of like your first turning point, was learning that this thing that you had been told your whole life you couldn't do, that you could do it. You mentioned a second one. Would you mind telling us about that?
Yeah, yeah. And this one is, I guess, probably interconnected as most things in life are. But the more I think about it, likely came out of, to some degree, the amount I read as a kid, as well as the time I grew up in. So in middle school and high school, I absolutely would have been one of those people who very unironically would say the phrase like, "Oh, I'm not like other girls." You know, I didn't want to be like other girls. And of course, everyone wants to think they're like unique and individual and special in general, right? That's not super surprising. But there's that very specific, not like other girls, not people thing that I had going. Um, and the turning point for me there, similar time in my life, probably. I was probably like 1920 ish, maybe somewhere in that general area. And I wish I could say it was just like a bolt of lightning moment,
How
but it
did you
wasn't.
see yourself different though? Like when you said like
Yep.
I'm not like other girls, like what did you mean by that?
Honestly, I'm not even sure I could have defined it. It was what I meant by it, and what I realized I meant by it later was I don't want to be identified with what society insists that girls and women are. Right. So I wouldn't probably have been able to tell you any like positive attributes I had that were unique in that realm. It would have been a lot of negatives, a lot of, oh, well, I'm not materialistic. I'm not catty. I'm not clicky, whatever. And then that was sort of reinforced by my interactions with my peers, because it turns out when you approach somebody with that kind of chip on your shoulder, and you approach other girls in your age group like they have something to prove to you, right? Because, oh, well, you know, prove to me that you're worth me being friends with or whatever. They don't tend to be super welcoming to that, or super amenable to it, shockingly. And so my little brain would just take that as confirmation that like, oh yeah, see, like other girls are like this. I'm so glad I'm not. And what really reinforced that is when I think back to the books I read a lot. And again, this is another one of those things that I hope is changing. I think it probably is. But you know, when I was a kid and an early teenager, a lot of the like children's and young adult fiction, if there was a female character, most of the time that's also how she was described. It's not, oh, she was super special because she was unique. It was, she wasn't like other girls. Most of these protagonists, they won't have a lot of other female friends, or they'll maybe have one. They'll be kind of described as more of a tomboy type a lot of the time. And I guess I got it into my head that, oh, this is the type of character worth writing about. I want to be the type of character worth writing about. So I think that's something I ended up internalizing, ended up living out, and unfortunately ended up really missing out on a lot of good friendships up until the point in my life where I kind of realized, oh, this might just be a story I've been telling myself and not something that bears out in the real world.
So it's what's fascinating to me is this. So that saying that you're not like other girls, if I heard you correctly, understood you correctly, or if I may be overanalyzing, was sort of just like a general rejection of society's expectations or definition of your identity, or a part of your identity, right? That those expectations of what a woman, a girl should be, you're saying it was just sort of like, I'm not that, and that's not me, and that you had in seeing sort of like how female protagonists were described, that rejection of womanhood in a way was seen as or portrayed as a positive thing.
Yep, exactly that. Yeah, and it wasn't until later that I realized like, oh, I am like other girls or women in some pretty key ways, because other girls and women are awesome, it turns out. Somehow it took me the better part of 2 decades to learn that, but you know, we got there. So my life is a lot better for it.
Yeah. So I guess what what experiences would you say you missed out on? Mostly just like relationships with other women that could have been more supportive or more strong, or that you just didn't get to have?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, I never had really a close group of female friends until after I sort of started wringing this particular thing out of myself. Um, I was very lucky that actually my best friend of now, 25 years, knew me during this period of my life, and bless her, she is the most patient person on earth. Um, Never really said a thing about it, and just kind of like accepted that about me. So I was very lucky to have had her, but it wasn't until after this that I realized that, oh, I could have this great, like, supportive, dynamic group of women around me, or multiple groups of women around me, and that was something that could be so helpful in life that I just hadn't had.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I went into a male-dominated field, and now I have to try very hard to find those types of groups in my life. But
so that's a decent segue then into talking about your career. But maybe as part of that, let me ask then. So you had your rebellious phase where you went and studied something that wasn't in the STEM field. You got your degree in that in economics. What made you sort of pivot, then change your mind and decide to do computer science specifically? So I'm sure you've said that not having a fear of math anymore, or having a lesser fear of math, was certainly helped open that door. But what made you walk through it, and why specifically computer science?
yeah, but as seems to happen with a lot of things in my life, a very lucky accident. So one of the gen ed requirements we had, or whatever, for my undergrad was you had to take some sort of lab science. And it was always kind of a bear, because you had to schedule, there's the actual class X times a week, and then there's like a lab section some other times, and it gets hard to schedule around. So one summer I decided, I'm like, I'm going to take Bio 101 or something over the summer instead of during the semester, and just knock that out. And then I decided, okay, well, as long as I'm doing that, I might as well, find another class that fulfills some requirement I have and take that at the same time, if I'm sticking around for 6 weeks or whatever it was. And about the only thing that still had room in it and that worked with my schedule was an intro to programming class, like CS 101 or whatever. And I took it thinking like, this will be, I was never a tech kid. I wasn't really allowed to like mess with gadgets a lot or whatever, because parents being professors are like, oh, it'll rot your brain. So didn't do a whole lot of that. I went in thinking like, oh, this will be hilarious. It'll drag my GPA down, I'm sure, but you know what, maybe it'll be interesting, and it's only 6 weeks. We'll grit my teeth and get through it. And then just ended up loving it. And at that point, I thought, I took another CS class or two then that fall. And at that point decided I wanted to add a second major. But it turns out when you're at a small school and it's your junior year at that point, midway through your junior year, and the CS department is like 2.5 professors, you can't really add enough classes to get a second major. So I ended up going with a minor. I finished my undergrad and I decided like, oh, maybe I'll try to finish the second bachelor's. I'm moving back to my hometown for a while. I can maybe take classes, at the school my parents taught at. And I walked into the computer science department chair's office intending to just talk about getting a second major. And somehow I still, to this day, don't understand how this happened. But like 20 minutes later, I walked out having agreed to do a master's degree. I could not tell you what happened in that meeting. The department chair just had some sort of like Jedi mind trick. So I was like, oh yeah, this seems like a good idea. That's how I ended up taking that trajectory. It wasn't necessarily any great desire to have an advanced degree so much as, I guess, being gullible.
Well, you say being gullible. Is it something that you regret?
It isn't. I had a lot of fun in my master's. It was by far and away the most stressful time of my life. But I think it's like legally required to be, probably. But especially the fact that I found machine learning, really that was more or less the track I chose, just because, you needed to have a research assistantship or something. There were a couple labs. One of them was the ML and AI lab. And because of my background in econ and having studied some game theory and whatever, it was a pretty natural fit for me. But I know that I'll probably never again be out there, publishing papers and whatever. And in some ways, that's probably very good for my sanity. But I do have some maybe misplaced nostalgia for it too.
Yeah, being one of the hardest times, but also it sounds like a lot of fun. What made you choose Bozeman as the venue for that?
I just knew. So after college, I decided we had some like family stuff going on, and so I was like, oh, I'll move back. I haven't decided really what I want to do yet post getting this, second degree that I was going to get. So I'll move back there. I'll help my mom out with some stuff. I'll take the time, the year or two, to get this wrapped up, and then we'll kind of figure it out from there. So it's definitely one of those transition times in my life, which again, I think you're basically legally obligated to have after college, that like, oh crap, what now?
Yeah.
Sort of moment.
the freak out crisis of identity.
Yeah.
Because you do, you hit that point where it's like your life, there's a roadmap and you're trying to follow it, right? At least I know that's not true for everybody, but for a lot of particularly middle-class Americans, that is like, you go to school, and then after you finish high school, you go to college, and after you finish college, but that, like, whether, some people decide to get a master's as you did, either way, once you're done with college, a lot of us hit this point where we're just like, oh shit, now what?
Yep. Well, and particularly because, so for a while there, I'd had it in my head that I was going to become a professor as well, but early in my econ degree, I was like, oh, I'll, go get a PhD in economics. I'll teach. It'll be great. This is what I want to do with my life. And then I ended up sort of through an entirely different side of my life that I was involved in at that point. In undergrad, I did a lot of sort of peer counseling and advocacy for people who experience campus sexual assault and stuff. So because of that, I ended up interfacing with the administration more than maybe your average student would have. And through that, I decided that I absolutely wanted nothing to do with college administrations ever again. So my whole life plan trajectory sort of broke in half right around that same time too.
This is like, there's a theme here probably through our generation, which is like, tell me the story that broke your faith in institutions.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's about the shape of it.
Oh, I'm curious to hear more about that, but I understand if that's a difficult thing to talk about, and if there's probably things you can't talk about in there too.
Yeah, that is an aspect of it. Is I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I am and I'm not allowed to disclose at this point.
That's fair.
I will say that I think maybe the moment that just ticked off the box of like, nope, we're done with this, was taking the time with some folks in the administration who did genuinely care, to compile a large report about, here's what other colleges similar to us are doing to, address the problem of, intimate partner violence and sexual violence on campuses. Here are some programs they have here or whatever, putting it down on a relevant person's desk, and having them tell me they weren't really going to read it and they didn't want to change anything about what they did during new student orientation for some of the suggestions we'd made, which were pretty simple and along the lines of like, hey, maybe make sure people know that we have a policy on sexual assault and where to find it, right? And this person told me, no, we need that time during orientation to talk about, more important things. That was the point where I was like, cool, I'm done here. We're done. Yeah, maybe that goes in the formative moment pile as well. I'm not sure now that I think about it.
Yeah, that's because because being sexually assaulted, it doesn't change your whole life or anything, right? Like
No,
it's not
no,
important that we
not
tell
important.
people how to deal with that or how to avoid it or. Ugh.
Yep. Yeah, I think that was, the whole phrase about like saying the quiet part out loud. I think that was maybe the first time I like witnessed that in person. I was like, oh, this administrator just said the quiet part out loud. They're like, nope, not important. Next thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that definitely took my romantic notions of being a professor, which you wouldn't have thought I'd had because I'd watched my parents do the whole like they could work any 80 hours a week they wanted sort of thing all my life. And somehow that didn't deter me. But then kind of what I witnessed during undergrad was enough that I said, I think we're going to choose a different path here. And that was part of why I ended up a little bit at loose ends after getting my undergrad.
What, I guess, how did you get into, because for as long as I've known you, you've been an advocate for women, for underrepresented groups, for, as we'll get into, diversity in tech and fostering it, hiring more people of diverse backgrounds. Where would you say your, maybe this is a dumb question, because being somebody in a group that is often underrepresented and oppressed, even now recently. I mean, not obviously it's been ongoing, but recent events have highlighted it more than ever. But the question is sort of like what. There are lots of women who, despite being in a group that is repressed, oppressed, however you want to put it, and if I keep trying to describe it, I'm going to put my foot in my mouth somehow. There are lots of women that don't take that same sort of advocacy, that don't take action on it in the way that you have, which isn't to say that they're bad. I'm just curious, like, what started that for you?
So I think part of it, unfortunately, is a somewhat unflattering thing about me that I've always been a little argumentative and a little like I've always enjoyed a sort of advocacy thing in general. When I was younger, before I had my revelation that like, wow, other women are people, it was mostly focused around sort of animal rights. I stopped eating meat when I was like 8, that sort of thing. So 8 or 9, somewhere around there. Which is a tough gig in Montana at that time, let me tell you. Got the hipsters came in now, and now it's fine. But back then, the first time I went to a vegetarian restaurant in college, a friend took me there, and I legitimately short-circuited because I was so used to there being 1 to 2 things on any given menu I could eat, and suddenly there were 2 pages, and I had to have someone else make a decision for me because I did not know how to make that type of decision. So needless to say, I think sort of that aspect of who I was and the choices I had made had sort of primed me for that. I was vegetarian and very concerned about animal rights in the state where that was not so much the norm. I grew up, so my father and his whole side of the family were Jewish, and I grew up in a community where that wasn't common or particularly understood. So that there was an aspect of that as well. So I always had this sort of sense of like, there are things that need fighting for, and that's a thing I want to do. And in fact, that's what drew me toward political science in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think again, the revelation that like, hey, other women are people and have these crappy experiences that they shouldn't be having to have. And other people in general. Because I mean, in that capacity, working at my college with that sort of advocacy, I ended up talking to a lot of sort of men who had experienced similar things and non-binary folks and whatever as well. But sort of as I got older, my definition of what do I want to advocate for expanded a lot more in that direction, I guess I'd say.
Have you found your chosen career track in technology to be a vehicle that allows you to continue that, or is it just sort of a complementary? Like how what's the intersection, I guess, of those spaces?
So for a while, I told myself that it was. a space where I could make that sort of difference. And I would amend that now to say it can be with the right support structure around you. It can go one of two ways. There's this article that I recommend that everyone in tech read, but particularly women and particularly managers as well, especially managers who might have female direct reports. It's that Being Glue article that I think I sent to you.
Yep.
That I can shoot you the link again. Do we have show notes? Can we put it in the show notes?
Yeah.
Anyway,
I can put it in I'll put it in the YouTube description in the notes.
That's the thing I've always heard on podcasts. Like, oh, it's in the show notes, and it sounds so professional and fancy. But
professional, I am not. But yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. We'll pretend like we're pros at this.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll circle around back on that. We'll put it in the Anyway, this article spends a lot of time delving into sort of issues that lead to women in tech doing a lot of what people tend to consider non-promotable work, glue work. Yeah. And one of the points this article makes is that early in your career, if you are from an underrepresented group, being promoted is itself diversity work. That's not a message you get a lot in tech. As a woman, and I think this holds true for other groups as well. You know, I have friends who are male, but people of color or whatever who have told similar stories, although maybe to a lesser extent. There's a sort of idea that you as a woman in tech need to also carry the weight of making tech a more hospitable place for other women. And while that's something I like doing and something I want to do, it also means that just navigating your early career is going to be harder, because on top of the work you are expected to do that is considered promotable, there's all this other stuff that you are pressured and maybe genuinely want to put your time toward. But when your reviews come around, most managers aren't going to care when you say, oh, well, yeah, I delivered fewer points or fewer tickets than, my male counterparts. But, I did all these career fairs and I mentored these other women in tech, and I was, volunteered to be on this panel and all these things that you are told you are being a bad woman in tech if you don't do. So under the right man, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off. So I guess, does that come with, because this is something that I've heard often, which is that if you are someone from an underrepresented group, that there's sort of this feeling that you are an emissary for that group, right? That you're sort of like, you're seen as like, you not only have all of the complications that come with being in an underrepresented group and all of the sort of biases against you, but that you're sort of looked to by everyone as like anything you do is now representative of that group or that trait.
Yep, I think that absolutely ties in. And yeah, just that idea that you somehow owe it to other women to blaze this trail. And in some ways it's hard to argue with, because man, somebody needs to do something, right? But the fact that it's generally placed on women, especially women earlier in their careers, and then everybody's like, gosh, why aren't these women getting promoted, or why are they burning out on being involved in women in tech things, when it's something you are told you should do, but unless you're under the right manager in the right company, you're probably not really going to get rewarded for it. You're not going to get the time to do it, and you might not get results from it.
Yeah, I remember that article when I read it. It was really interesting because, of course, I work with women as well and women leaders. And I've seen that. I've seen how a lot of women are the first to step up when there's, a question of, can somebody do this thing that, is sort of maybe a communal task or something that helps everyone, but isn't necessarily directly aligned with the like business goals of that particular team. And yeah, oftentimes that stuff, like, we don't get credit for that, right? Like, and that's
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and sort of broader diversity initiatives at companies don't tend to do a good idea of kind of setting up those incentives either. Because I've seen kind of two sides of the same coin, and one is maybe like kind of more insidious than the other. But it's either like a one way to say it is, oh, it's everybody's like individual responsibility to contribute to this. The other is it's worse other places, you know, for women, for whatever, or it used to be worse, so it isn't a problem really, or it's not an emergent problem. We don't need to make it more than just, oh, individual responsibility, do what you can. You know, maybe your manager will take on some initiatives for how to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? But we're not gonna set concrete goals for it or incentivize those goals. And I always find that super interesting because, like, diversity does impact the bottom line, right? At this point, like, customers care about it, investors care about it, potential new hires care about it. Failing to care about it loses you people, and attrition is expensive. Any other thing that impacts the bottom line in that way, if you said like, oh, it's fine, it's just up to individuals, you'd be laughed out of the room, right? Like, or, oh, imagine if in a, you know, all company meeting, somebody says like, oh yeah, well, we haven't met really any of our SLAs, but some companies don't even have SLAs. So like, why is this a big deal? Or like, you know, with, you know, oh, we aren't going to set or, you know, do anything with OKRs, you know, just everybody just kind of work on what you want to. And if it happens to align with like company goals or strategy, like that's great.
Yeah.
Those aren't conversations you hear, but those are the conversations you hear around DEI initiatives.
Yeah. And okay, so this is potentially a really ignorant question. I'm going to frame it like that way because I don't know, I might be putting my foot in my mouth here. From a logistics standpoint, is there a supply like, because I say this because I know that, like, for example, if you were to say we need to have more women in leadership positions, yes, absolutely. The representation at, like, because there is an undeniable age gradient, right? Like, there are the CEOs right now are usually 60s, 70s, 80s, right? Like, in that range. And in some ways, they are an artifact of their time, right? Where the pipelines, like, there were even fewer women that were being encouraged to get into leadership or promoted even 20 years ago, right? So how has that changed? You know, how much of, like, if every company said we want to be as diverse as possible, at what point does that become a logistical problem? And I know that, again, some of the ignorance in this is like, I know that I don't think that's where we're at right now. Like, I don't think every company is really making an effort to be as diverse as possible. If they were, in the tech field at least, it strikes me as still very white male dominated. And I believe that at least a large part of that is an artifact of, you know, I got told when I was a young kid that I could be in computer science, and, you know, my person of color friend didn't, or that wasn't an option, or for you that wasn't really something that you were told, right? Like, some of this is an artifact of society. At what point does this become a logistical challenge? How do we work through that so that eventually we can all work in wonderfully diverse places?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's not at all an ignorant question. That's a huge, burning, important question that I am going to give my sort of half-baked opinion on, and then probably a month from now be like, oh my God, why did I say that? But that's how we grow, right? That's how we grow. Yeah, there's sort of two aspects to that, right? Maybe three. So we, as a broader sort of I don't know, industry or whatever have been working on fixing aspects of the pipeline, right? Because at first, the first fire was like, oh, women just like aren't applying to these jobs. Okay, there's becoming sort of some accepted conventional wisdom about how do we fix that? How do we get, how do we hire more women? We're fixing that aspect now, and it's helping, sort of further down the pipeline as well, where, hopefully, at least in a lot of scenarios I've seen, and granted, I see a small slice of the world, particularly not having children myself, but it seems like female children are getting a lot more messages from a lot of places now that's like, nope, like this can be, math can be for girls, just like, I watch a lot of kids TV, I'm realizing, but, we're getting math can be for girls and like empathy can be for boys and stuff like that. So I think that's slowly bubbling up.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt. It's just terrifying that like the idea that we ever were, the whole like boys will be boys, like men should be assholes. Like that is such a,
yeah. There's a lot to unpack there, but yeah. So slowly but surely things are bubbling up like that far in the pipeline where most places will at least say they care about hiring more women, more people of color, more, and we're talking a lot about visible diversity. I should also put a nod toward like, there are a lot of kinds of like not visible diversity that are super important, right? I mean, you and I are both sort of examples of that, where neither of us were the people like programming our TI calculators in 6th grade and, heading off to MIT at 17 or whatever.
Right.
I think that getting people further up into leadership positions requires a couple things that we aren't seeing yet, because so much of the focus is on, I'm gonna stick with just the gender aspect, because that's one aspect I can narrow down to. I think most of this generalizes. There's a lot of focus on how do we get women and not how do we keep women and how do we promote women. For a lot of reasons. Some of them are just as simple as not doing enough to counteract sort of biases that people might have, even if they don't know they have them. So stuff like having a really unstructured promotion process, always going to favor the people who are seen as belonging in tech. Always going to be harder for people who don't. This is part of why when I interview somewhere, always one of my first questions is like, oh, do you have like a leveling guide for this position? And if not, when do we see that? Because without that, you're completely left open to that sort of bias. There's the issue we talked about with the glue work, the non-promotable work, and how a lot of companies don't care about or don't know that it's a problem to even begin to care about, like, oh, this is going to have an impact. How do we make that work promotable, or how do we distribute it more evenly? There's the broader societal issue of the imbalance in sort of amount of, I don't want to say free time, but like use of time outside of work, right? Across societies, women still do more unpaid labor in the home in general. And when part of getting promoted is often like, oh, do you have time to, or emotional energy to be reading white papers and doing side projects and whatever, you can't really even that out when your female engineers are still going home and doing on average hours more per week of unpaid stuff. And then I promise this is the last one I'm going to list, because I've just been like rattling this off. But there's also the issue of you kind of need diversity to get diversity. In terms of, I'm not going to, either I'm not going to really subconsciously think that I can become a leader if I look around and see no leaders who look like me or have a similar experience, or maybe I'll know that I could, but think, God, that is going to be such an uphill battle, and I'm going to be in a room surrounded by people who are going to discount my experience all day. And I know I feel a certain sense of, well, you should blaze the trail, but God, do I want to?
Well, the perception of a culture internally is such a like it's a barrier for a lot of people, right? Like I'll say I'll try not to talk a lot about my current employer and all of that, but the Spaces, the company that I joined just last week, is in sports betting, so online sports betting, and we're building an application for that. And I was not super excited when I applied for it because my perception of what I expected the internal culture to be, like I was willing to say like I'll talk to them, we'll explore it, but if you had asked me like when I applied, like what I expected to see was sort of like the worst of Silicon Valley bro coding culture meets the worst of like toxic masculinity sports culture. Now, what I've found, and of course, the whole reason why I then eventually joined the company is because it was anything but that. But if I was hesitant to even put in my application because of my perception of what I expected to find there, I would expect there are lots of women and people of diverse candidates of diverse background who are going through that same mental exercise and then just never expressing interest.
Yep. Yeah. No, you've heard my whole TED talk on on phrasing things when you're recruiting and hiring, and it can be a huge aspect of it. And yeah, I'm glad to see that it's kind of borne out that the company is not like that. Because I remember when you first told me like, oh, it's a sports betting company, I was like, whoa. You probably saw the face I made a couple weeks ago or whatever when you told me. So very glad to hear that it has exceeded expectations on that front, because I would have had the same trepidation, I think.
Yeah. So you've taken a shift in your career recently, because we'll come back to the gender in tech, but I wanted to ask about your shift from AI, machine learning, data science now. Your next role will be as more of a platform engineer, site reliability. What prompted that shift? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, specialized in machine learning in grad school. And if I could do it over again, as much as I love the publishing, I think I would have gone back and just gotten the second bachelor's. And the only reason for that is because it still left some gaps, because there are the things you're expected to do in a master's degree in computer science are so different than the things you would be doing in undergrad. And so it's like nobody cared that I'd never taken a networks course, for example, so I didn't have to. Nobody cared about the quality of my code because I was writing stuff that would be used to run some experiments to publish a paper, and then like maybe some random other grad student would email me 3 years later asking for my code, but that was maybe my customer. So I got out of my master's degree and I was looking at jobs, and I sort of had the sense of, okay, well, I know I really like machine learning. I know I like that. I know that there are still some gaps where I wouldn't feel qualified to be sort of a vanilla engineer anyway. And so that's what kind of pulled me toward what was then a pretty new title of new and ill-defined. It's still ill-defined. It's not new, of data scientist. And I got into the industry and had a lot of fun with it in some ways. But I also realized that people, because I wasn't going to like FANG companies, people generally didn't know what to do with a data scientist once they got one. And I sort of had to make my own path. And there's a lot of that's fun about that, because I'm a little bit egotistical. I liked that, I got to feel very important and very busy, right? Because you're in the companies that I had been a part of as a data scientist, you're sort of helping set up their data program, right? Their ML program. As someone who's new in their career, this is super flattering, right? To get to feel that important and to kind of get to be in the room with the big kids for a lot of things. But for a lot of reasons similar to that being glue article, it can also be really detrimental if it becomes your entire early career. And it's sort of a recipe for burnout, because you're going to spend a lot more time in meetings than you're spending coding. You're not really, I had one manager who was just absolutely fantastic at being a sort of a buffer between sort of stakeholder whims and me. But normally you're going to have 3 or 4 people in that chain as someone early in your career. And I had one, and then for a while, none. So as fun as it can be, it is a great recipe for burnout, uh, especially in an area like data science and machine learning, where there's usually a lack of data literacy in the rest of the company, a lack of available data to work with, really overbearing stakeholder interest, because despite the lack of data literacy, everybody knows they want it.
Mm-hmm.
And you're generally given this sort of vague directive to just like, oh yeah, we have a data scientist, go provide value from data. And you don't really get direction on like what value is, let alone the resources at your disposal.
Is there a sort of like data scientist at a lot of places might as well read data wizard, like as far as like what they expect, like it's all just data magic. We don't really know what any of this means. We're not literate, but do your data stuff and like sprinkle that magic on top of our product.
Yeah. Have you watched BoJack Horseman?
I haven't. No, I'm familiar
Uh,
with like some of the characters, but I've maybe watched like an episode.
so you end up in a lot of conversations that feel like there's this character called Vincent Adultman, who is clearly three children in a trench coat, and only the running joke is only one other character realizes this and nobody else around him does. And so Vincent gets asked what he does for work or something along those lines, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I work at a business factory, and business wise, it all seems like appropriate business." And that's roughly the same conversations oftentimes that you'll end up having around, especially like an early data science initiative is like, yeah, we use a data driven paradigm to derive value from the data, and that's what my role is, but the day to day of what you do is ill defined, and the goalposts move.
What would you say are some of the most common misconceptions about machine learning, about data wizardry? What are the kinds of things that drive dysfunction in this area in organizations?
Oh man. um, I think one of the biggest things is just a lack of incentive structure for product teams to interact with data teams. Because you can say, yeah, we want to take information about how users are interacting with our platform and use it to drive decisions. The problem is, you need that data to be collected. In order for that data to be collected, you need the product teams to have room on their schedule, and, well, before they even have room on their schedule, they need to understand that this is an ask. They need to understand why it might be important, and they need to have time to implement it, and they need to have incentive to implement it. Because if you're coming in as a data team and saying, hey, yeah, implement these, these analytics for us so that 6 months from now we can write a model around this, and this product team is saying, we're already behind on our OKRs, and it would be legitimately irresponsible of the team management to say like, yeah, we'll prioritize that. So you end up in this situation where you can't get the data you need, or you can get some data that's maybe adjacent to what you need, but is out of date or collected poorly, or whatever the case may be. And then you're asked, and usually way too little of it. And then you're asked to take that and pull a pattern out of it and integrate that pattern back in. Maybe you write a model that fits the requirements to predict what you want to predict. Okay, now you've got the same problem. You want to get this integrated with the product. Well, do your product teams have time? Do they have the resources? Is the product even set up in such a way where something like that can be integrated? Because a lot of the time, these companies have been operating for years under the assumption that data is at best a byproduct and more often kind of a liability. And now you're saying, okay, without any further context, take all that, throw that out the window. Now you're working with us on this.
And for anybody who might not be familiar with some of the jargon, so OKRs is objectives and key results. A goals is probably the easiest way to just shorthand that for somebody who's not familiar with the industry. And when you say that data is often seen as a liability, that's interesting too, because again, the whole like data leaks, the sort of the security side of things.
Yep.
But I at least I think a lot of people are starting to come around to the idea that like, no, your data is actually like that is the thing that enables whatever value you drive. Like that's actually like your key resource.
Yep. Oh, and I want to be clear too that sometimes it's considered a liability and sometimes it really should be, right? We've all seen enough situations of like, everybody gets really scared that there's going to be some general AI that's going to go Terminator or something. People really aren't scared enough of like, no, the bigger problem is there's vast amounts of data that could be leaked or used for nefarious purposes or whatever, driving those models. So I don't mean to poo-poo this idea of like data as a liability, because it is.
Yeah.
The difference is if you want to have a data science program, you have to find ways to manage that liability. Otherwise, like, I've had it suggested to me one too many times that like, oh, well, we can't collect any data, but we want this model. Can you just generate synthetic data and use that? Like, yes, the model will not be worth anything, but you're like, yes, I can do that. So,
because it's only as good as the data on which it's built, and if it's all synthetic, then it's not necessarily a reflection of reality.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a happy medium to be found, and I think a lot of companies haven't thought the strategy through to the point where they can even sort of take a stab at what that balance should be.
So, all right. So I want to keep on track with like, then are the difficulties in this space primarily what made you rethink your focus in your career and move more towards the platform side of things?
That was definitely a part of it, along with just sort of where I was in my career, where again, I had spent a lot of time in that space of being very important, but really very important, in quotes, getting to feel very important, but missing out on the adolescence of my career because of it, where I realized as I was sort of looking around at other postings and things like that, because you're supposed to do that every so often, I was like, man, I am probably operating at a senior level, but by some metrics wouldn't be qualified for even a more junior level position. Because, if the question is, oh, how often do you personally ship models? And my answer is, I don't, because I'm busy sort of going to meetings about what models we're even going to ship. It's not a good look. So I decided I wanted to get more into writing code again. And I decided that I didn't like the low expectations that a lot of people have for data scientists around their ability to sort of write code and participate in some technical discussions. So I decided, maybe it's time to make a switch.
Yeah, cool. The other burning question that I wanted to ask before, because I didn't want to derail that question further.
No.
What are the odds on having Skynet and humanity being destroyed by Terminators in 20 or 30 years?
Oh, I think we're doing a good enough job of destroying stuff other ways.
We don't need help.
Yeah, I think something else is gonna get us first. It's like, okay, if someone actually, you know what it reminds me of, and this is gonna be a very Raleigh style rambling story. So I lived in Philly for a while. When I lived in Philly, I lived on a like fairly busy side street, and my desk looked right out onto the street. And I remember at one point, pretty early on in the pandemic, where we still weren't sure like what kind of PPE you need to wear and whatever. People really liked riding motorcycles and dirt bikes and stuff on this busy side road for whatever reason. And I saw this guy just absolutely like tearing ass down the road on a motorcycle, wearing like full on like hazmat suit, face shield, mask under the face shield, everything, and no helmet. And I was like, okay, well, technically, yes, like COVID will not be what kills you, but probably not because of the PPE. That's a rough analog for how I feel about these issues of Skynet and some general AI taking over. Is like, sure, is there a conceivable universe in which we entrust decisions that shouldn't be entrusted to an AI and bad things happen. Yes, that happens already all the time, right? We take these data-driven recommendations on diagnostics and on who should get bail and who shouldn't, not realizing that the data is trained on is biased. Yeah. That is very bad. In fact, there is another book that I want to put in the show notes called Invisible Women that talks about a lot of the impacts of the data gap on women specifically. Yeah. These are all things that could be bad if some government decided to take things a bazillion step further and say, okay, we're going to, entrust all of our governmental decisions to this AI that was trained on probably bad data. Like, yes, that's not going to be good. But my goodness, with all the other things that are currently going on as a society, I think something else is going to get us long before we're going to develop the Terminator.
If you had to take a guess on what that thing would be.
Goodness gracious. Wow. I feel like my opinion is so valued right now, and it probably shouldn't be. Having read Spillover, which is a book about other sort of zoonotic diseases and things like that, my main hope is really that we don't see too many more mutations in bird flus, because, man, we actually got unfortunately pretty lucky with COVID as spillover diseases go. So yeah, something like that would be real, not great. And then of course we've nuked our climate already. So like, my goodness, that's sort of a foregone conclusion. But yeah, I worry about both of those a whole lot more than I worry about, oh no, we made this AI to make paper clips and suddenly it's eating everyone or whatever.
The fascinating, have we talked about, this is a huge tangent, but have we talked about sort of the, it's kind of a big concept, but how software development at the aggregate level is basically just an exploration of self?
No, I'm curious.
All right. Well, so it ties into this question of AI. I'll tie it back around to this. But the thing that's interesting to me is sort of like, if you were to look at, if you had access to every code base on Earth, right? Let's say you're an alien, you're observing humanity, and the only thing that you have access to is our code base. And there's actually maybe sort of some interesting, like, code itself is one of the more interesting things. First off, it's been shown that people that are good at coding usually come from a background of good linguistic like comprehension, and like linguistic aptitude is one of the best measures for projecting whether somebody will be good at coding. So when you said earlier that like you showed linguistic aptitude early in life, like that tracks then that you would end up in software. But it's an interesting language because the exercise of writing code literally is a translation exercise of taking thoughts, feelings, concepts, and putting them down in math, right? Like ultimately it all goes down to math. And if you were an alien species coming to Earth, and you all you had access to was our code base, you would learn a lot of really interesting things about humanity. And I've written about this, and sort of like the example I give is, let's say that you got access to a code base for an application that delivered pizza, right? Like if that's what it did, well, just by examining the code base and some of the connected code bases with it, you would learn things like, oh, well, sometimes when you order the pizza, the application has to say no, like it has to refuse the order. Well, why? And then you'd learn about things like money and currency and exchange and banks and, and different currencies and like the banking system. By exploring things like the delivery routines, you would learn about maps and about human dwelling structures and ingress and egress points and, roads. And maybe if it's being delivered by drones, you would learn about like, air. You could, basically like the crazy like expanding bubble here is that literally the exercise of writing code is, we are building applications that do things for us, right? Like this thing that delivers pizza to me, it helps me get calories that I continue to subsist on. But in order to be able to do that, it needs to know a lot about me. It needs to, like, we need to be able to document things like, what are common pizza toppings? What do people like on pizzas? Different sizes, and like, those sorts of things. Like, these are dumb, but these are things that ultimately tell a story about humanity. Some small part of it maybe, but in the aggregate, our code base tells a lot. Like, it paints a pretty not complete picture yet, but the overall, like, if you were to pull back to like the space, the a billion foot view of this, the aggregate exercise of software development is the documentation of humanity and humanity's needs in math. And so if you were to tell me, like, what would an AI born out of this system know, it would know us pretty damn well. Mm-hmm. What it decides to do from that point is kind of like, I don't know. Maybe it decides like, hey, free pizza for everybody. Or, maybe it decides like, wow, these people are pretty fucked up. But it's just sort of fascinating that, like, thinking about like an AI that gets like born out of an artifact, a linguistic artifact that is attempting at its core to describe humans and human problems and the solutions to those problems. I think there's a very interesting story there to tell about like what could come of that.
Absolutely, especially with questions of what is it taught to incentivize? That's usually the biggest thing I like to emphasize with people is there's this idea of an AI as a thing that learns, which is true. And to your point, which is super fascinating, by the way, and I want to talk about this offline at some point, but there's a lot there that can be learned and pulled out. The thing about AI models, machine learning models, I don't really view there as being a difference. I realize I've been sort of using the terms interchangeably without ever saying that. Is that they need to be given some sort of goal for here's what you optimize, here's what you predict, here's how you evaluate the goodness of something you've learned. That, I think, is the key aspect in terms of how will what is learned be used. That's why I threw in that sort of silly paperclip example. It's some thought experiment that I'm probably terribly misquoting, but the idea is, okay, imagine you made an AI, gave it access to a whole bunch of information, maybe even like you're talking about, maybe to our code bases to extract sort of some relationships from, and said, okay, your whole job in life is to make paperclips. Well, you have to add some parameters to that because there's this thought experiment of, okay, well, what if it learns that the only thing that matters is making paperclips and it consumes every resource in the universe to make paperclips? It's not because the AI was evil. It's because the people developing it failed to appropriately specify parameters and objectives for it. You could see this in diagnostics and cancer research. This is one of the sort of standard examples you're told to watch out for as a data scientist, is if you have a case where, okay, we're going to be looking at lung x-rays or scans, and we're looking for this rare cancer that occurs less than 1% of the time. Well, if you're not careful to specify your parameters and say, hey, AI, we care, a lot more about false positives and false negatives or things like that, your AI is going to learn, oh, okay, I'm just going to say, no, there isn't cancer, because 99% of the time it'll be right if it says that every time. You take that and you expand that out into more and more sort of complex ideas and spaces, and you start to see why, the things that might be interesting or scary are not what is something learning, but rather, what is it learning it from, and what are we telling it to do with it?
What does it think the rules of the game are?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because it's like one of the things about humans, and so to make an AI that would be human in a way, is that nobody tells us the rules of the game necessarily. We're born, and then it's like, okay, rule 1 is survive. Rule 2 is like find your own meaning. Yeah.
I mean, yes and no though, because we do still have that sort of feedback mechanism that you have to construct or build in for an algorithm. We know, we seek pleasure, we avoid pain. We learn language, maybe as some broader quest for meaning, but also because it's the thing that lets us say like, hey, I want stuff to put in my face. Like I would like food,
Yeah.
For an AI, you have to provide that feedback mechanism of, oh, when you get this thing, when you do this thing, that is the thing that is good. That's what you want. We have sort of intrinsic mechanisms for that prod us to learn about the world in the way that, what is essentially a giant set of equations doesn't.
Yeah. Have you
That's what we have
heard
to
the
construct.
theory of language as a living symbiote?
Tell me about it.
This is fascinating too, and I'll spend like 3 seconds on it, and then we'll move on. But it's just the idea that language itself is sort of a living, breathing organism, a reflection of sort of the aggregate culture, like the common culture, thoughts, patterns, right? That like you take a child that's raised in the woods by wolves or whatever that hasn't been like taught language, and their ability to experience the world, like, in fact, this is as somebody who like I learned Russian, right? Have you learned another language? Do you speak another language?
Yeah, so this is actually why I watched a lot of children's TV, is because there's a limited amount of things at an easy level in Hebrew that you can consume as like somebody who's learning the language. So
awesome.
Yeah, I'm working on it. I don't have the amount of Hebrew that you all have of Russian. I'll say that.
Well, so once upon a time I was fluent, and it's been a long time, but I was at the point where I was thinking in Russian. It wasn't just like, I wasn't translating in my head. And there have been numerous studies that show that your grasp of language, or the language that you operate in, language concepts are the lens through which we view and describe the world. And so certain languages have different vocabulary than others, or lack certain concepts, or like I tell a story about wanting to tell a group of Russians that I was excited, but they don't really have this concept of aggressive optimism, and so the word that I found in the dictionary actually meant horny, and I said the wrong thing, and it was funny and embarrassing. But that sort of concept of like the language is your view through the world. It literally shapes your ability to understand, comprehend, and create different concepts about the world. So a child who grows to be an adult without language literally doesn't have the mental vocabulary, so to speak, to actually articulate and work through abstract concepts that nevertheless have real-world application. They're not able to reason about the world or view it even in the same way that those of us who are infected with the virus of language intentionally at birth by our parents, we are literally a different species, those of us who have language versus those of us who don't. And that even those of us who speak different languages think in different ways, as I found like there were slightly different ways in which I would express thoughts or even approach different situations when I was speaking Russian versus when I was speaking English with other people who spoke English. So yeah, effectively the whole idea is that language is a living entity. The language we use, the ideas that we talk about, that society itself, like the language is a vehicle, but it is also sort of like in aggregate the sum of those thoughts and experiences. And as it evolves, it's evolving with us, but it is also a thing that, again, like it's a symbiote, right? Like it's alive, we are alive, and the two of us together, like that's the thing that, like we are a symbiotic relationship. It's a fascinating thing, and I'm not articulating it well, but it's kind of cool.
No, you are actually. So something I was thinking about as you were talking about this is kind of wondering about the intersection of that idea versus what we were kind of just talking about was the idea of, sort of us almost self-documenting ourselves in our society through code, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm wondering, and obviously there's absolutely no way to ever get an answer to this, but it is an interesting thought experiment, is, okay, let's take code written maybe in the same language, maybe not, just code bases written by people who have different native languages. Because I'm sure that native language impacts what your code looks like, even if all the code is in the same language, what sort of patterns you use, things like that, stylistic choices. I'm curious how different AI is learning about human societies from different code bases based on sort of different natural human language native speakers would learn the world differently, because I'm sure there would be marked differences. But yeah, anyway, there's so many confounding variables, and who knows. But
yeah, and a lot of that
it
would
is
be
an
cultural,
interesting idea,
right? Like the needs that different cultures have based on geographies and biologies and things like that would be different, but those would all effectively be documented at the mathematical level. Yeah, I don't know. Super cool. Sorry for the diversion there.
I don't think we had like a set list of things. I did. If I was supposed to come in with one, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Fair enough. Well, cool. I'm glad we got to talk a bit about. I'm looking at my notes here. I'm glad we got to talk about machine learning, AI. I didn't just want to spend the whole time talking about gender and diversity, even though I know that those are things that you're very passionate about. Let's go back to that specifically when it comes to, so what, maybe the best way to put this is like, here's a burning question I have. And again, maybe this is like, I'm guilty of like, I like sort of large questions, sort of high level abstractions. How much change can be made in this space to enable diverse communities, to facilitate, the creation and flourishing of diverse communities, specifically companies in our system right now? In other words, like, is there a ceiling? Is there a point at which we have to say, like, you know what, American corporate capitalism is at, like, we've hit the point where, like, that's our limiting factor now? I say this because, like, my perception of the corporate culture is that at some level, the system itself favors corporate leadership structures that are maybe ruthless in their pursuit of certain objectives that can conflict with our desire to create safe and diverse communities. Does that make sense?
Yep. Oh, it does. I guess I sort of have two things to say about this, but I think the first one is that there's sort of a layer even below the, like, what are we really, like, chasing at the top level, right, in terms of profits and whatever. There's kind of this layer in the middle where, in order to make progress at all, we need to have sort of openness and authenticity. Wow, I'm using a lot of words that I hate right now. I'm gonna explain more concretely what I mean by this.
Don't apologize for authenticity, but I will ask you to define it at some point. You don't have to do it.
Right? No, I just, like, I open my mouth and the HBR comes out, and that's not the sense of authenticity that I mean. All right, basically, a better way to put it: in order to make progress, you need to very specifically own your shit as a company, by which I mean you need to be doing things like, okay, let's look at, like, our intercompany surveys, maybe, of, there's, like, the Great Places to Work survey and things of that general flavor. If you are not measuring the difference in sort of those scores between your different groups within your company and making that information sort of visible and actionable, you're not going to get anywhere. Because for those who, I guess, I realize we have technically an audience here. For those who aren't familiar with the Great Places to Work surveys and that sort of general flavor of things, tech in particular really likes having these awards that are based on, okay, everybody internal to your company takes some survey that talks about different aspects of their experience as an employee, and then scoring well in different categories. You can win some awards and make a big LinkedIn post about it. So the thing about the Great Places to Work survey and things like it is if you're just going out and trumpeting from the parapets, hey, 95% of our employees, felt supported and represented. But that 95% is also the 95% who are white men. That's not telling you what you think or hope it is. That's not telling you you have a very, supportive and, equitable workplace. It's just telling you that that's how numbers work. In order to, when you're doing things like, okay, we're going to measure internally, what's the difference between, what's the satisfaction score or whatever for men versus women, for people of color versus not, maybe, across different office locations, or if there are different office locations, let's really dig into what employee experience is like, how we can improve it, both for retention purposes, for recruiting, for people just sort of general happiness. If you are a publicly traded company, you have a lot of incentives not to do that. Not just because it never feels good to admit what you're not doing well, but because releasing that sort of information can hurt your earnings. This is, again, one of those quiet parts that sometimes gets said out loud.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's not even about companies getting, punished is a poor word, but certainly not having it incentivized in our current system to take dramatic actions that would detract from anything except like profit seeking. But also just because you can't even really get to that point of taking the dramatic actions because you can't share within or outside your company the information you'd need to inform those decisions. Privately traded companies aren't going to be subject to this in the same way. There's more wiggle room. But I do think that's a limiting factor in general. Luckily, I do think there's still a lot of improvement between the baseline we're at now and where we're going to get capped by that. So that in and of itself is, I think, a pretty worthy end.
Is there, because I think part of the question for me too is like, it appears that there is a preference for a certain kind of personality to staff the C-suite and the board, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sort of stereotypical, like, these are sharks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And do you have to be, so much of this comes from a place where we are beholden to certain powers, right? Like if you want money to start your company, then you have to go seek it from somewhere, and where you get your funding, right? The people who give you power have expectations, and they give you power, but then you give them power in return, right? So like, is the only way to run, are we in a place where the system is so broken that the only way to run a truly, like if you could define your utopia of a company, right, in the way that internal equity and diversity and like all of those things that we strive for, picture that paragon of a company. Can that exist right now, having taken money from Wall Street?
Oof. Oh man. Probably not. But here's what my knee-jerk reaction was with that. And I think it's maybe not that helpful, but maybe interesting. Because I had this little moment of thinking, okay, what would my utopia of a company look like? And I realized as I thought about it, that it would be, frankly, fulfilling a lot of needs or niches that we only need companies to fill because of the way we've set up our economic system in the first place. It's like, you know what, at the end of the day, I don't want that much of my self-actualization to have to come through my company. I don't necessarily want a utopian company. I want one where, you know what, I feel pretty good about what I do, and I feel like I'm pretty well valued as well as anybody else. And you know, there's all these needs that we're trying to fill in terms of like, oh, we need to, you know, a sense of purpose and like really strong community, and that's all great. It would be even greater if we weren't having to get those things from our job in the first place.
Yeah.
So similar to, honestly, this is kind of a leap, but I'm wearing my Plan C shirt. I can't not talk about it. Similar to now, we have all these companies coming out and saying, you know, hey, we're going to help our employees who need to, you know, travel to access, you know, abortion or gender affirming care or anything like that. On the one hand, I think it's great that companies are doing that. I have some asterisks there because, like, you know, it's not great to have to tell your employer you're seeking that sort of care and then potentially having, you know, retaliation for it or whatever the case. Yeah. But let's assume that all of these companies are doing it in good faith and that, you know, they will help and whatever. I love that that's happening. I don't want it to not happen. I would really love us not to be in a place where that's something we have to rely on our employers for in the first place.
Yeah.
That's just like not a niche that we should have a society where companies are having to fill. And so similarly, you know, even with DEI efforts, I think there's a point where it's like, this is something that's broken with sort of the general world. And I don't know how well a company could fill it.
There is an interesting trend that I have noticed among a lot of people in our generation, which is that we are increasingly sort of distancing ourselves and our identity from the companies that we work with. And I think that's a good thing, right? Like, you shouldn't be like attaching so much of your identity to your job, to what brings in income, was probably never a healthy thing to begin with. And yet I know that there's a sort of, at least in you know, grandpa was a company man, right? Is like the, you know, grandpa worked for IBM his whole life and they were good to him. And we're not in that kind of landscape now. And there's a lot of signaling that isn't actually in line with intent or belief, right? Like, how many of these companies that are actually saying like, oh yeah, we will pay for gender affirming care and all of these things, and yet they know, based on the internal statistics, that they have like 2 trans employees, and, you know, whatever that they expect their actuaries and statisticians have told them that like they probably won't even have to pay out or whatever, right? So, and how much of that is just trying to like signal versus really being like what they believe in. Again, coming back to that, like what we talked about earlier, that sort of like a crumbling faith in institutions. So much of our generation is very cynical in believing that no matter what companies and institutions say, there's always an agenda behind it. And so the response, at least from a lot of people that I know, has just been like, my job is my job. I'm going to work. I want it to be a place that I enjoy being, a community that I enjoy being a part of. But I am going to intentionally try and seek fulfillment and belonging and all of those other things in other parts of my life outside of work.
Yeah, because I mean, you have to at a certain point. And I will say the signaling thing I think is very real. At the same time, I try to take a little bit of I try to take a step back and just say, you know what, maybe it is just signaling. There are a lot worse things companies could be signaling and do signal. Amen. So that's something I have to remind myself about so much, is I'm like, you know what, even if they're not fully sincere about it, like, I will take it, because they could be going the Chick-fil-A route, and instead they're taking they're going the like gender affirming care matters route. And I'm like, you know what, cool. My expectations were like here, you met them like here, I'll take it.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
So.
No, yeah, absolutely. I know I maybe am more cynical than most in some of these ways, but Well, I asked you before, like you used the word authentic.
Mm-hmm.
This is an interesting question to me. It's something that I've talked to, like, even my mom and I had this conversation, and I've had this conversation with my wife. What to you does that word mean? Like, what does it mean to be authentic?
Oh man. So in the context I used it, it was actually just the wrong word to choose. Um, I was trying to think of something that wasn't open and wasn't data driven because I was like, no, I hate both of those. And then I like grabbed authentic out of the basket, which was worse. Um,
Fair enough, but you opened the the jar now, so
exactly. Um, what would authentic mean for me in that context?
if I said
I think,
Raleigh's fantastic, she's such a great person, she's so authentic, what what does that mean?
oh goodness, I would put, what would I put in the authentic bucket? I would put um, owning up to mistakes, being pretty clear about observations that you've had, and gosh, oh, I'm trying so hard not to like dig into all my like weird like dialectical behavior therapy like words as well. Because this is the problem. You try to find words with more words, and you're like, oh my god, none of these have meaning anymore because the HBR or like mindfulness apps got a hold of all of them. Um, okay. No, I'm spinning this around on you. What conclusions did you and your wife come to on the meaning of the word authenticity?
Well, I don't ask because the intent was not to for this to turn into another one of Matt's diatribes. I'm genuinely curious, like what you think it might mean to live a life of authenticity. Like I'm seeking meaning here too, right? So I'm just curious to get your take on that.
Life of authenticity. Um, Obviously, the first step toward it is going to be not lying to yourself. I feel like when you're not being authentic is when you tend to accumulate a lot of resentment because there's this idea of, okay, now I am just straight up digging into the DBT, but there's this idea of, the most painful thought in the world is this shouldn't be happening. The second most painful is you should see this the way I do. I think authenticity is trying to live by those two principles and saying, okay, I'm going to try to see things as they are, not as I think they should be. I'm going to try to communicate things as they are, not as I think they should be. And I'm going to accept that that is probably going to differ wildly from other people's experiences, but I'm still going to do the best to communicate mine.
That's cool. I like that. That's a good definition.
And also, I'm sure you're going to get a text from me at like 3 a.m. being like, no, wait, I know what my definition is now. It's like, this is something I'm going to be thinking about for a while. But, on the spot, that's what I've got.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That was kind of unfair to throw that kind of question at you on the spot.
No, it's great for me. We're trying to socialize our puppy by giving her a lot of different experiences and having her, have to think about a lot of different things. I'm just getting socialized.
Tell us about your puppy.
Yeah, so we got ourselves a Saint Bernard poodle mix, who we knew was going to be big, and it turns out is going to be even bigger.
Saint Bernard poodle mix, otherwise known as
Saint Berdoodle.
Saint Berdoodle, because
Yeah.
you have to have a mixed name.
Oh yeah. Most of the time when I say it, people think I'm saying Bernadoodle because I guess a lot of people are doing like a Bernese poodle mix, and I'm like, nope, bigger and dumber. Like just like shrink the brain, expand the rest. Okay, she's not. Unfortunately, she's pretty smart, which I'm worried about because, like, man, I don't want my dog to be smarter than me. I want a dumb, happy dog. That's what I'm looking for here. But yeah, she is, as of today, she's 11 weeks old and 30 pounds.
Wow. And she will get to be how big?
So they guessed 90, but I think she's gonna top that. She's gonna be north of that for sure. Because of the parvovirus risk in our area, she can't like touch the ground outside really. So we have to, if we're like taking her to the car up until for another 4 weeks until she gets all her shots, she can't do that. So if we're like carrying her to the car or something, we have to carry her, which is great because our like parking garage is a block away. we're getting to the point where I don't know if I'm going to be able to carry her for another 4 weeks. Like she's a big girl.
Well, so then where does she do her business? Then do you just like
Oh,
have like a pad in the house? Because if she can't touch the ground outside.
Okay, so I'm now gonna like accidentally do a commercial for a product. So there's, you're welcome. You might be able to get sponsorship from Porch Potty for
No,
this.
no,
So
there are not enough people listening to this.
the 4 listeners might all
Yeah,
buy one
there we
after
go.
this. So there's where I'm sitting right now. I'm like facing out onto this little patio we have because we're on the second floor. There's this thing that was mostly made for like people in high rises in New York and stuff, but it's called a porch potty. And it's like a little, it's not that little, it's pretty big, but it's little compared to Ori. Like, yeah, maybe bigger than my desk. Sort of plastic wicker thing with like some fake grass on it. And it like drains into a container that you can like pour out. And so we have one of those on our patio. I was mildly terrified that we'd never be able to teach her how to pee anywhere else again. But we did take her to a friend's house that had a yard over the weekend. She did okay. So like, we're doing good. But yeah, it's a giant pain, and I'm really, really looking forward to 4 weeks from now when, or I guess 5 weeks from now when we'll just be able to actually take her outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
There are benefits to living in such a dog friendly city, and then there's the fact that everyone else has a dog. So until your dog is vaccinated, it's like cool. They're just like vulnerable to everything.
Did you grow up with dogs, or is this the first dog you've had?
Yep. Grew up with German short hairs. So whenever people are like, I want a high energy dog, I'm like, no, you don't. You don't know what that means.
Yeah.
My dad was a hunter. And so they're bird dogs, right? They'll go like point at the bird and like flush it out for you and stuff. And you take them on a 10+ mile hike 3 times a week, or they chew through your baseboards. So this is why, along with allergies, when I was looking at dog breeds, I was like, I want a poodle, and I want to mix it with something that is basically a sentient shag carpet. So that's where we ended up.
A carpet that can love you.
Exactly. Yeah, pretty much. Like it will love you and food and sleep.
Yeah.
And that's what you got. So
that's awesome. I love dogs.
She's very cute. I'll have to send you some more pictures sometime. I think she's still doing okay in the crate. We're going to find out. I'll have to check in with friends at some point.
Well, we're getting in on that point where you said she might need some love and attention. So we'll probably wrap things up here. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? I know we talked about these topics ahead of time, but is there something we didn't cover, some topic that you're like, I care about this, something else I want to say here?
I think we got to most of it. I appreciate in particular the amount of space you sort of gave me to, I don't want to say ramble, because it was information technically, but to get very excited and talking about my sort of gender dynamics and tech stuff, because that's something that, as you know, I'm currently on a little bit of a break between jobs. I've had like 8 weeks in there, and it's something that I was worried I wasn't going to be able to, kind of get back into with as much sort of energy and enthusiasm as I had before. And this has been a really good reminder that like, no, this is something that's pretty core to me. So.
Well, thank you for sharing your stories. It's,
of course.
I love the chance to just sort of talk, and one of the reasons why, even though like I've sort of stopped doing the stand-up thing, but I want to keep doing this, is because it's just so fun hearing people's stories and learning more about you and what makes you you and what makes you tick, and learning things that'll hopefully change me too. So thanks for
thank
coming.
you. Thank you for being the sort of person I want to, and your viewers, I suppose, that I want to share these stories and thoughts with. So always appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks, Rollie. And we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Talk soon. Take care, Matt.